Hey there, welcome back. In this episode, I'm going to examine moments where influencers take things further with wild animals. From a wilderness blogger who baited a grizzly bear outside a remote Montana cabin, to a survival influencer who entered Australian bushland without a single piece of emergency equipment. Let's start with the first story, where a food-conditioned grizzly and a series of deliberate choices turned a remote cabin rental into a fatal wildlife incident. It was the 14th of October 2016, in the remote woodland of northern Montana, where autumn had already stripped the aspens to bare branches and frost crept across the clearing each morning. Regional wildlife managers had posted warnings about unusually aggressive bear activity throughout the area that season. Residents from surrounding properties had reported damaged structures, overturned debris, and escalating encounters for weeks. Rowan Vale, 27, was a wilderness travel content creator from Oregon, whose videos centered on off-grid living, remote landscapes, and what she marketed as authentic encounters with the natural world. Her earlier work had built a modest but loyal following. As her audience grew, pressure from sponsors followed, pushing toward increasingly extreme footage. She had no formal wildlife training, and her understanding of bear behavior came largely from outdoor forums and the kind of confidence built from never being seriously tested. She rented a private cabin in isolated woodland outside any managed park boundary, accompanied by a cameraman and a photographer. The nearest occupied property sat over a mile away. Local wildlife managers had already circulated warnings about unusually aggressive pre-hibernation bear activity that autumn, but Rowan treated that danger as an asset rather than a reason to reconsider. And that's the part that stays with me. The warnings weren't buried in some internal report. They were public, and the response was to treat them as a selling point. Over several days, the group left fish remains and food scraps near the edge of the tree line to attract wildlife for nighttime footage. Wildlife officers later suspected the bear had already been obtaining unsecured food from neighboring rural properties before arriving at the cabin, which would explain how quickly it lost its avoidance behavior around the group. A large grizzly began appearing near the property each evening. At first, it held at the tree line. Over the following nights, it stayed longer, moved closer, and stopped retreating when the group made noise. I think this is where a lot of people reading this for the first time start to feel uncomfortable. Leaving fish remains near a remote cabin in grizzly country during hyperphagia season isn't a gray area. Every piece of outdoor safety literature that covers bear country addresses this directly, and the group did it repeatedly, over multiple days, deliberately. During one encounter, the bear performed a bluff charge after catching the scent of food near the clearing's edge. Rowan dismissed it on camera and continued filming. The moment the bluff charge became dismissed as content is the one I keep coming back to, because that was the clearest possible signal that the situation had produced. What matters here is what a grizzly bear in late October actually represents biologically. The period known as hyperphagia drives adult grizzlies to consume up to 20,000 calories per day, compelling them to range widely, take risks they would otherwise avoid, and respond aggressively to anything threatening access to a food source. An adult male grizzly at this stage can weigh between 400 and 790 pounds and cover ground at nearly 35 miles per hour. A bear that has stopped retreating from human presence and associates a location with reliable food is no longer exhibiting avoidance behavior. Repeated bluff charges during food conditioning incidents are considered a major escalation warning by wildlife officers. On the final evening, the bear approached the clearing again, moving toward the scraps near the tree line. Rowan closed the distance to continue filming, despite the bear remaining actively engaged with the food source. The bear reacted instantly. The cameraman dropped the equipment and ran. The photographer barricaded herself inside the cabin and contacted emergency services. Due to the remote terrain, responders did not reach the property for several hours. Footage recorded during earlier sessions that evening was later reviewed by investigators. At the request of Rowan's family, that material was not publicly released and has remained out of circulation since. Wildlife officials confirmed the bear had become fully food conditioned through repeated exposure to human attractants. The behavior the group had interpreted as habituation was escalating defensive aggression around a reliable food source. What the subsequent investigation also revealed was that the volume of material left near the tree line over the course of several days was sufficient to establish the clearing as a consistent food source in the bear's behavioral pattern. When I read through the officer's assessment notes, what struck me was the language they used. They didn't describe the bear as aggressive. They described it as conditioned. That distinction matters because it means the animal wasn't acting outside its normal behavior. It was acting exactly within it. The conditions had simply been engineered to make that behavior fatal. Rowan Vale was found deceased at the property. She was 27 years old. The cabin was taken out of service pending formal review, and wildlife managers reinforced regional advisories across the area. What I keep coming back to is that none of what happened was unforeseeable. The bear's behavior escalated in a clear sequence over multiple days. The bluff charge alone should have ended it entirely. That story involved a predator drawn in through deliberate baiting over several days. The next case moves to a controlled environment, a private reptile facility in Central Florida, where a prank content creator decided the barrier between him and a Nile crocodile was just another rule worth breaking. It was the 9th of March 2015 at a small privately owned reptile attraction in Central Florida where midday heat settled flat across low concrete enclosures and the air carried the mineral smell of standing water. The facility ran live demonstrations and educational presentations, drawing families and regional tourists through a modest set of exhibit areas. Behind reinforced viewing barriers, one enclosure held the facility's largest resident, a massive Nile crocodile used for feeding demonstrations. Nolan Pike, 24, was a prank format content creator whose entire model was built around confrontation, rule violations, and filmed consequences. His audience rewarded him for provoking staff, ignoring restrictions, and engineering situations that put him somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. He visited the facility alongside a cameraman and a friend. Throughout the visit, Nolan openly mocked the trained handlers and joked that the crocodile appeared fake due to its prolonged stillness. That detail bothers me more than almost anything else in this story. Those handlers know that animal through every feeding and every behavioral shift. Nolan had been in the building for an hour and decided they were the ones who didn't understand it. Staff were occupied preparing a nearby feeding demonstration, and a maintenance access gate adjacent to the viewing platform was left unsecured. Nolan saw it. The decision he made in that moment is exactly the kind of decision that prank content rewards. Push past the barrier, get the reaction, film it. The problem is that the animal on the other side doesn't care about the format. What most observers misread about Nile crocodiles is that the stillness is not inactivity, it is the operational state. An adult Nile crocodile can measure between 13 and 16 feet in length and weigh anywhere from 500 to over 1,600 pounds. Their thermoregulation requires extended periods of near motionless basking that leads untrained observers to drastically underestimate them. The recorded bite force exceeds 3,700 pounds per square inch. More critically, a crocodile that has been motionless for hours can cover several feet and close its jaws in a fraction of a second. Most untrained observers never recognize the warning signs before the strike occurs. Nolan slipped past the unsecured gate while the cameraman filmed from outside the barrier. He moved to the edge of the enclosure and leaned over the wall, reaching toward the animal's snout. The crocodile exploded from the waterline without warning, clamping onto his arm and dragging him against the enclosure edge before pulling him into the water. Witnesses described immediate violent churning as the animal began rolling. Staff evacuated nearby visitors while handlers attempted to separate the crocodile using poles before emergency crews could access Nolan. By the time personnel safely reached him, Nolan had already sustained catastrophic injuries. Nolan Pike was declared dead at the scene. The cameraman's footage from outside the barrier was recovered and reviewed by investigators during the compliance inquiry. It was not publicly released. The facility's legal representatives and Nolan's family both requested it remain out of public circulation. The facility later faced regulatory penalties and temporary suspension. What investigators found during the post-incident review was a pattern of minor compliance gaps that had accumulated over time, insufficient staffing ratios during peak visitor hours, irregular gate checks during staff transitions, and inadequate separation between public access areas and maintenance corridors. none of those individual gaps would necessarily have produced a fatal outcome on their own. Combined with a visitor who was actively looking for a way past the restrictions, they created a pathway that shouldn't have existed. That's something I think about with a lot of these cases, the way small, individually manageable failures stack up on top of each other until they're not manageable at all. That encounter happened inside a contained facility where the only thing standing between Nolan and the crocodile was a barrier he chose to step around. The next story removes the facility entirely, a private property outside Las Vegas, a subadult male African lion on a holding transfer, and a luxury influencer who believed confidence was a substitute for professional animal handling. It was the 28th of January 2018 on a private rural property in the high desert outside Las Vegas, Nevada, where the air was cold at night and warming fast by mid-morning. The land was flat, isolated, and well off the nearest public road. The property operated as an unlicensed exotic animal holding site used informally by a private collector network to stage animals during transfers. An existing enclosure currently held a subadult male African lion recently moved through that same network. Luca Serrano, 22, built his online presence around luxury goods, exotic vehicles, and high-risk stunts framed as personal courage. His engagement numbers had dropped noticeably in the months prior, and he had become preoccupied with a content format he had watched perform well influencers posing alongside large predators. Through private collector channels, he arranged access to the property and arrived with a videographer and a personal assistant. I've come across this pattern before. Someone watching a professional do something, incredibly skill dependent, and concluding that willingness is the real variable. With a subadult male lion in a confined enclosure, that assumption is not even close to accurate. The lion had been flagged by at least one prior handler for behavioral instability around unfamiliar people. It displayed persistent pacing, a recognized stress indicator in captive large felines, and had reportedly demonstrated reactive aggression during recent transfers. That information existed in documentation that either didn't reach Luca or wasn't treated as relevant. Both outcomes are bad. One of them is worse. Before the attack, the behavioral profile of a subadult male lion in an unfamiliar enclosure requires specific understanding. African lions are apex predators capable of reaching over 50 miles per hour in a short sprint. A subadult male, roughly 2 to 4 years old, is in a developmental stage defined by heightened aggression, elevated territorial sensitivity, and impulsive social responses. Persistent pacing in a captive animal at this stage is a documented stress response indicating full arousal. An animal in that state, inside a confined space, presented with an unfamiliar person carrying raw meat, is an apex predator with no established reason for restraint. Luca entered the enclosure carrying raw meat, positioning for close-range footage. The videographer indicated from outside that the distance was unsafe. Luca moved closer. I think about that moment often. The one person with the clearest view flagged it, and the response was to close the distance. Luca genuinely believed his confidence was a variable the lion would respond to. That is not how predator behavior works. The lion's posture changed abruptly, its focus locking forward before it lunged. The filming crew scattered. No one on site was trained or equipped to deploy tranquilizers safely. Emergency responders were unable to access the enclosure for an extended period while the lion remained highly agitated inside. Luca Serrano was pronounced dead before medical personnel could reach him. He was 22 years old. The videographer's footage was seized as part of the investigation. It was not publicly released. Luca's family confirmed they had no interest in the material being made available. Investigators uncovered multiple illegal permit violations connected to the lion's transfer and the property's operating status. The animal had passed through at least 3 different private owners in the months before the incident, none of whom held current legal authority to possess it. Each transfer had been informally documented within the collector network with no outside oversight at any stage. What that means practically is that an animal with a documented history of behavioral instability had been moving through unregulated hands before ending up in an enclosure on an unlicensed property with no qualified staff present. Charges were pursued against several individuals involved, and the collector network faced civil and regulatory consequences. Luca was 22 years old, his engagement was dropping, and he was chasing something he'd seen work online. None of that excuses the decision, but it explains the kind of pressure that can push someone toward one. That incident unfolded inside a confined space with no exit. The next story moves offshore several miles into the open Pacific, where a tiger shark made repeated passes around a diver who had no formal certification and no real understanding of what those passes were building toward. It was the 22nd of July, 2017, several miles off the coast of Oahu, Hawaii, where the water dropped fast from turquoise shallows into deep blue-green open ocean. Visibility underwater shifted with current and plankton concentration, meaning anything approaching would appear at close range before being seen. Kieran Holt, 31, was an ocean adventure content creator who presented himself as a seasoned marine specialist. In practice, he lacked advanced dive certification and had developed his techniques primarily through observation and imitation of professional footage. He organized an unofficial offshore shark dive with a fellow content creator, describing the planned footage as career-defining. Multiple licensed charter operators declined the booking after confirming neither Holt nor his partner held the required qualifications. A private boat operator eventually agreed to take them out. That detail matters. Professional operators who work those waters looked at this booking and said no. The fact that Kieran kept looking until someone agreed didn't change what those first operators saw. The two descended into deep offshore water, carrying handheld cameras. Visibility was limited, currents were disorienting, and a large tiger shark appeared and began making slow, repeated passes at close range. Tiger sharks are one of the most broadly distributed large shark species in the Pacific and account for a significant proportion of fatal shark interactions globally. An adult tiger shark ranges between 10 and 14 feet in length and between 850 and 1,400 pounds. Marine researchers often regard repeated close passes by tiger sharks as a high-risk behavioral escalation. Trained professional shark divers respond by ascending slowly, maintaining body orientation toward the animal, and making no physical contact. Attempting to redirect a large shark during an active pass sequence elevates the animal's arousal and removes whatever passive window the behavior might have provided. And executing it at all requires years of supervised, species-specific experience that cannot be approximated from video. Those repeated passes are the moment where someone with proper training ascends. That is the non-negotiable response. Kieran looked at that behavior and saw an opportunity to demonstrate control. I understand the thinking, but you cannot close that experience gap by watching enough footage. As the passes grew shorter and more direct, Kieran extended his arm toward the shark during a close approach. The shark abruptly turned back across his blind side and struck, biting into his arm and torso. His dive partner's camera recorded chaotic, obscured movement before the footage became unreadable. His body was recovered later that day near the diving site with catastrophic injuries. Footage from the dive partner's camera was recovered by marine safety officials and treated as part of the formal investigation. It was not publicly released. The victim's family formally requested it remain permanently withheld, a request that has been honored. Marine safety officials identified the absence of a licensed guide, the lack of formal training, and the physical contact attempt as the primary contributing factors. The private boat operator was questioned but faced no formal charges. Kieran's dive partner gave a formal account to marine safety officials in the days that followed. From what was documented, the partner had already begun ascending before the attack escalated, which is exactly the response the situation called for. I don't say that to draw a clean contrast between the two of them. I say it because it illustrates, as clearly as any case I've come across, what the difference between trained instinct and improvised imitation actually looks like in practice. One of them ascended. One of them didn't. Kieran Holt was 31 years old. His next of kin were notified by Hawaiian authorities. That encounter played out miles from shore with no support structure and an animal in its natural element. The next story moves to South Africa's Limpopo province, where a luxury travel influencer ignored every warning her guide gave her and kept applying pressure to an elephant that had already shown every sign it had reached its limit. It was the 11th of November 2013 in South Africa's Limpopo province, where dry season heat pressed flat across the low veld and dust hung above every trail. A semi-private wildlife reserve in the region still offered mounted elephant experiences at the time, though the practice had already attracted criticism from wildlife welfare organizations. Guides operated under strict behavioral protocols designed to keep both animals and guests stable throughout. Celeste Marrow, 26, was a luxury travel content creator whose platform centered on high-end safari experiences and curated wildlife moments. Her management team had recently pushed toward more dramatic footage in response to flagging engagement. The mounted elephant experience was intended as the centerpiece of the visit. Before the ride began, guides gave clear and repeated instructions. Stay calm, avoid sudden movements, and refrain from loud behavior near the animal. These were the behavioral baseline required to keep a large, stress-sensitive animal stable enough to carry a rider. As filming continued, Celeste grew frustrated by the elephant's pace. Despite repeated guidance from the handler, she began making sharp, loud vocalizations near the animal's head and applied repeated heel pressure against its shoulder to force faster movement, the guide told her, multiple times. And what makes this particular story difficult to process is that it wasn't ignorance. The warning was right there, it was just treated as something that applied to her. The handler halted the ride and began attempting to stabilize the animal. What is essential to understand here is the behavioral threshold of an African bush elephant under stress. An adult female weighs between 6,000 and 9,000 pounds and can accelerate to over 25 miles per hour with very little warning. The physical stress indicators are specific and measurable. Ear spreading, stiff posture, elevated tail carriage, and low-frequency rumbling vocalizations. These signal that the animal has reached a threshold. An elephant exhibiting all four simultaneously while continuing to receive aversive stimuli from a rider is not a situation any handler on foot can resolve through verbal intervention alone. At nearly the same moment, a nearby tourist accidentally dropped a heavy camera rig onto rocks a short distance away. The impact produced a sharp, metallic sound. The already agitated elephant reacted immediately, bolting sideways off the trail. Celeste lost balance and fell directly into the animal's path. Handlers attempted repeated intervention before the situation escalated beyond their control. She was trampled. Filming had been ongoing throughout the session. That footage was reviewed in full by investigators during the formal inquiry. At the request of Celeste's family, it was not released publicly and was withheld from all media coverage. Investigators concluded the outcome resulted from cumulative stress escalation rather than unprovoked aggression. The reserve suspended mounted elephant experiences following an independent review. Investigators concluded the handler had followed established safety procedures throughout. The case drew limited media attention at the time, partly because mounted elephant tourism in semi-private reserves was still widely accepted in parts of southern Africa in 2013, and partly because the investigation focused narrowly on the circumstances rather than the broader practice. In the years that followed, the reserve's decision to suspend mounted experiences was consistent with a wider industry shift driven by welfare concerns and a growing body of research on stress responses in working elephants. Whether that shift would have occurred as quickly without incidents like this one is difficult to say. What I can say is that the behavioral indicators described in the investigation report appear in virtually every serious piece of elephant welfare literature published in the decades since. The warning signs were not obscure. They were well documented. They just weren't being treated as a reason to stop. Celeste Marrow died from injuries sustained at the scene. She was 26 years old. The animal did not malfunction. It responded exactly as the behavioral indicators predicted. The handler read those signs correctly in real time and still couldn't override a decision that wasn't his to make. That's the part that's hardest to sit with. The next story moves to the Australian outback, where the danger had nothing to do with a large predator's aggression and everything to do with a survival influencer who refused to carry the one piece of equipment that would have kept him alive. It was the 3rd of August 2014 in the tropical savanna bushland of the northeastern Northern Territory, where the dry season had left the scrub brittle and the ground cracked hard underfoot. Rocky outcrops broke the flat terrain at intervals, and fallen dry brush collected in dense, concealing mats beneath the low vegetation. It was the kind of landscape that looked emptier than it was. Declan Voss was a 26-year-old survival challenge content creator whose brand was built entirely around rejecting modern safety tools. His videos framed personal locator beacons, GPS devices, and emergency communication equipment as symbols of cultural dependency. His audience rewarded the performance of total self-sufficiency, and Declan had come to treat the absence of safety gear not as a risk but as a content philosophy. For his largest project yet, Declan entered isolated bushland in the northeastern Northern Territory, planning to survive alone for 7 days while filming himself. Local guides advised him to carry at minimum a personal locator beacon and a basic medical kit. He declined both, along with a radio and emergency flares, on the grounds that safety equipment compromised authenticity. I'll be direct. Entering the remote Australian bushland without emergency communication equipment is not a philosophy. It is a documented risk factor that appears consistently in the case files of people who did not come back. There is a point where a philosophy stops being a challenge and starts being a trap you've built for yourself. 3 days in, Declan reached beneath dry brush near a rocky outcrop while collecting firewood. A coastal taipan concealed beneath the vegetation struck his lower leg before retreating into the grass. The coastal taipan is considered one of the most medically dangerous snakes in Australia. Its venom contains a presynaptic neurotoxin called taipoxin that attacks the nervous system, depleting the neuromuscular junctions required for voluntary muscle control. Taipan envenomation can initially appear mild before systemic effects begin within 1 to 3 hours. Without antivenom administered in a clinical setting, death from respiratory failure or cardiovascular collapse is the consistent outcome. The correct first aid response is pressure immobilization firm, continuous bandaging from the bite site up the affected limb with the patient fully immobilized. Continued physical exertion accelerates systemic venom distribution. Declan attempted to treat the bite using improvised methods from online research, then continued hiking toward his extraction point. That decision, not the bite, is where the outcome was determined. He had been envenomated by one of the most dangerous snakes on Earth, in remote bushland with no way to call for help, and he kept walking. Over the following hours, initial symptoms took hold: nausea, vomiting, and early muscle weakness. Declan continued moving. By the following morning, the deterioration had accelerated significantly. Escalating muscle weakness, deepening confusion, and labored breathing had set in. Severely disoriented, he had deviated far from his planned route by the time search operations were initiated. When he failed to return at his scheduled extraction time, his sister contacted local authorities. Search helicopters were deployed. He was located unresponsive roughly 2 days after the bite, several miles from his intended route. Declan Voss was pronounced dead at the scene. Cause of death was documented as acute neurotoxic envenomation, complicated by continued exertion and the complete absence of emergency communication equipment. His camera was recovered during the search operation, and footage was reviewed by investigators as part of the case file. At the explicit request of his family, it was never publicly released. In the months following Declan's death, several Australian wilderness and emergency response organizations issued public statements specifically addressing the survival content genre and the risks associated with entering remote terrain without communication equipment. The statements weren't aimed at outdoor recreation broadly. They were aimed at a specific content model that framed safety gear as a compromise rather than a baseline. Declan's case was referenced directly in at least one of those statements. That doesn't happen often. When it does, it's worth paying attention to, because it means the people who had to search for him across miles of remote bushland over 2 days felt strongly enough about what they saw to say something publicly. Rescue officials stated publicly that a functioning personal locator beacon would have allowed responders to reach him within hours, well within the window where antivenom could have changed the outcome. There was no ambiguity about what caused the delay. There was simply no equipment to find him.